Welcome to the Flock and Hive podcast, a place for curious minds to explore all that makes life so weird and wonderful. And this week, the key is to be very, very proud of what you have created. There are always going to be critics. Not everybody is going to like what you do. And whilst the industry might not recognize you as a perfumer or a nose, if you are creating beautiful scents and you are selling them and people are loving them and giving you money for them, you have every right to call yourself a perfumer.
We speak to Karen Gilbert about the art of perfumery. Hello, it's episode 15.
It is. Welcome back, everybody.
We've got another one about smells, haven't we?
Yes, it's all about smells. It is perfumery, but it's so much more than just smelling nice. We've got Karen Gilbert here, who does an amazing podcast called the Perfume Making Podcast that I've been listening to because I am doing a diploma in perfumery. And what I love about her, she's so direct. She has a different approach. So she is going to bust some myths about who can be a perfumer, her particular approach to it, and where to start if you want to get into it.
Perfume and everything around it, the olfactory senses, is very formative, isn't it?
It is. And, once again, it reminds us of another podcast episode, the one on anosmia with Duncan Bogue, where we really realised through that conversation that we just don't realise how important our sense of smell is and how much actually we use it. Before I did my perfumery diploma, I didn't really think my life had much to do with perfume. But then I look back and I realise I can plot various parts of my life on it, and I use it for so many things that I just hadn't really thought about.
It's almost autobiographical, isn't it? I recently was at an airport in duty free and was walking through the smells, being able to chart different parts of my life, particularly blue jeans. That was a holiday romance of yesteryear that just immediately came back when I had a sniff.
Oh my God. Yeah, the haunting of the male aftershave from the 90s. Yeah. I mean, I have that obsession can stop me in my tracks.
But it's a shame that you don't see any of the really old classics like Exclamation. And if I look at a picture of Tresor, not only does the smell come back, like a whole genre of my childhood does.
No, I'm with you. I can close my eyes. I can see that little sort of diamondy, squarey bottle.
And they came in lovely little miniatures, didn't they? And Grandma would definitely get us just a box of those miniature clinky bottles of all the really sweet, chemically smelling stuff that we loved.
Those smells in those boxes were quite iconic, I think, in the perfume industry. So do you remember Lulu, the blue one?
Yeah.
You might have been too young to remember. I think there was a knockoff version of that somewhere on a French holiday where they sort of infused bath salts with it. And that smell just takes me back.
There is an age, isn't there? I don't know about boys. I guess I will start to learn in a few years with my boys. But definitely as a girl, it's a stepping stone to forming part of your aesthetic, isn't it? It's like part of your personality, but it does something different to just the aesthetics. It's how you feel and it sets you up for the day. Like one thing that really fascinated me during COVID, during lockdown, and my husband was working from home every day, he would still shower spruce and liberally put on his quite expensive Le Labo perfume. And I'd be like, what are you doing? It was a really unsettling time. Everyone was wondering about whether they were going to be able to sustain their jobs working from home. So it kept that sense of routine. It probably, it has an association with him with feeling professional, like even though he's in his workplace. There was a lot going on with him using that scent every day, rather than me being like, you're wasting the expensive stuff. I actually really appreciated why he was doing that in the end. Just shows that it just permeates more than just one sense.
I do love, though, how smells can catch you unawares sometimes. And it's because it bypasses a lot of your other organs and goes straight into your brain and your memory bank. Scents really can capture you unawares and remind you of things very quickly, which can be beautiful, which can be sad, but it's always, always a reminder of how human you are.
Mm.
It's also people, isn't it? I'm often a bit sad that I don't think Dad ever had an aftershave because I don't ever get that whiff of someone when they walk by.
Dad did have a scent. It was Grecian 2000, that awful hair dye, permeated into pillowcases for decades.
Yeah, not nice, not the best memory, but yeah, I can still smell it on the pillowcases in Mum's house, actually. And actually, there is a word, Boo, that reminds me of that. And some might say it might be the word of the week.
Word of the week, word of the week. What about,
Yes.
what was specifically about Grecian 2000?
Pretty much. I think this word was developed from the Old French to describe Wish in 2000. Now, but the word is noisome. So it's a word that derives from Middle English, noisome, like annoyance or harm, which in turn comes from the Old French annoyer, to harm or to annoy. And it originally describes something harmful, but with particular reference to an offensive smell. So it's basically if something is noisome, it smells offensive.
Oh, okay. Well, speaking of unwanted, annoying smells, I do have a bit of a 20-year-old bone to pick with you.
Oh, uh-oh. Why?
It was when we lived together in Tooting. I mean, to be fair, I think you did this to cover up my offensive fajita fumes. But for some, I don't know why we didn't have diffusers or like oil burners, but you used to spray perfume on light bulbs to sort of set an ambiance.
Yes, that was a great idea, wasn't it?
No, because it always ended up smelling of burning chemicals from cheap, no offense, perfume, and it used to really annoy me. I mentioned it to you a couple of times. I don't think we didn't ever fall out for it, but it was just like old school scene setting, but didn't quite pull off. Do you remember?
I remember doing that, thinking, but actually it never worked. It never ever worked well.
No,
But I remember doing it quite a lot.
me too. I mean, diffusers did exist then, didn't they?
I I think they did, but not in the way they do now, where you just walk into the big Sainsbury's and they're in front of your face in the home section for about 3 quid. We definitely wouldn't have had the budget to be spoiling ourselves with extras like that.
Yeah. Even though we were drinking very expensive Brunello with takeaway curries.
We were, but remember, I worked for a wine magazine, and they they sent it home for free.
So basically, noisome, you and your budget ambience setting in our living room in Tooting, I would say is completely descriptive of that.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, perhaps we should use this opportunity to go from things that smell bad to things that smell good, shall we?
Yes.
So let's hear from our guest, Karen Gilbert, all about the art of perfumery. Here's what she had to say. Karen Gilbert, thank you so much for coming onto the Flock and Hive podcast today. I'm so excited to talk to you because I've recently started a diploma in perfumery, and every time I tell somebody that, without fail, they go a bit glassy-eyed and say, oh, that's something I've always wanted to do, especially my colleagues and friends in the wine trade. So I would love to have a bit of a conversation with you that is a love letter to perfumery, talking about our sense of smell in general, but also to get some proper tips and tricks from you for how to get started in perfumery. So, shall we begin at the beginning? And can you tell us what you do and why you wanted to do it?
Thank you. There are so many sort of crossovers, and I know obviously you're in the wine industry as well. And I actually do get a lot of people who are from the kind of food and drink industry coming to classes. But yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, I am Karen Gilbert. I have been in the industry for what seems like forever. Really? Is that even a thing? So yeah, people are kind of intrigued by it. And fast forward to today, over the last, I think since 2011, I've been teaching people how to create their own fragrances. I started out because a lot of people were asking me about natural perfumes, and over the years it's changed quite a lot. I did a 5-year stint at IFF, and then I went to work for Neal's Yard. So I went into product development at Neal's Yard. And for those of you listening, a lot of you in the UK probably know Neal's Yard as a natural essential oil, natural skincare pioneer. Um, but yeah, I loved that side of it. So I did sort of 5 years for big fragrance, if you like, and then 5 years for natural, organic, eco, completely opposite sides of the industry. So one of the things I love about the way I teach, my approach now, is a very straight down the line approach of the middle ground, because you often get people saying, oh, naturals, you can't make a proper perfume out of just natural materials. And then you've got people on the other side saying, oh, all synthetics are evil, toxic chemicals, and, it's really bad, and, you shouldn't be using that. And I've seen both sides of the industry, and there's good and bad in both. And so I get a lot of people coming to me because they want to make their own fragrances. I get a lot of people who want to make fragrances with just naturals. And so I do teach that, and I get a lot of those. Yeah, I teach what I call mixed media, and I teach naturals. And I started out really because people couldn't find natural fragrances on the market, especially in the UK, because of our regulatory system, because of all the rules and regs around allergens. It's actually quite hard to make a fully natural perfume with all of the materials that you want. So I started teaching one-day classes in natural perfumery. So my idea was that people would come in, they couldn't buy it off the shelf, but they could make their own. And then it kind of led into people saying, yeah, but I want to launch my own brand. Oh, and I want to learn about synthetics as well. And I want to learn about sustainable ingredients. It's been a really interesting journey over the last, for coming up for 14 now. So, and a lot of my alumni from my mastermind course have launched their own brands as well. So that is really, really exciting to see. And we've had, a couple of 15-year-old boys book on my next class. And I'm like, what's going on? And then talking to my social media person, she's like, yeah, there's this massive trend in young men, young boys in fragrance, and they're getting really excited about it. So yeah, it's changing every single day.
I've always had this idea that to be a professional perfumer, you had to be a trained nose and or have a degree in chemistry, and I'm sure all those things are really important. But But actually, they're not vital, are they? If you really want to start, there is a simpler way of doing it.
It's one of my main bugbears, and it's something that anybody who's been following me for a while will know that I really kind of stamp my feet and get on my soapbox about, because the fragrance industry, it's been very, very closed off from the outside world. There was all of this secrecy, and there are some people that say you can't become a perfumer unless you've gone to one of the industry elite schools and you've got a chemistry degree. And then there are people that say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if you've gone to one of those schools, unless you're French and you were born into the Grasse tradition and trained by your grandfather, like you can't be a perfumer. So there's lots of different, you know, sections of the fragrance industry that will say, oh, you can't do that because. And I think that's changed massively. When I started teaching back in 2010, it was still very much a no, I don't think you can do this. If you're self taught, or if you're what they would call a kitchen sink perfumer, you are not going to be able to make a good perfume. You're not going to be accepted in the industry. And, it's definitely a no. Back then, that was definitely true. And, between myself and lots of my sort of slightly indie industry colleagues have come out and said, actually, no, you can do this, and opened up the educational arm to teach people. And this is something that I say to all of my students. There is a reason why the fragrance industry want you to have a chemistry degree. And there's a reason why they want you to train for the amount of years that they do. And primarily it's because the types of fragrance that make the most money, things like laundry detergent, toilet cleaner, functional products, if you like. And if you are going to go into the industry and be an industry perfumer, the likelihood is you're going to be expected to work on those types of fragrances. So, in order to get those kinds of fragrances to work in the bases, they're very technical, and you've got to know how to do that without causing chemical reactions that are adverse to the fragrances. It is a very chemistry based thing. If you are wanting to create a perfume oil, if you want to create a fragrance for an alcohol base, that there's not that level of technical in terms of chemistry that you need to know. Yes, it's helpful to have a bit of an understanding of organic chemistry and what the natural materials are all made of chemicals. Natural essential oils are made up of naturally occurring chemicals. So it is really good to know your aldehydes from your esters, from your phenols, and all of the things that are important to make sure that you're creating safe perfumes. You don't need to have a degree in chemistry to know that. Yes, you need to learn that bit, but it's not as complex as people make it out to be. And The other reason why they teach in perfumery schools, you've got to study your materials for a couple of years and you've got to memorize everything, is because the reality of a working perfumer in the industry inside a big company is that they create fragrances on a spreadsheet, on their software. They are not this this myth of having this perfumer's organ all laid out where you're smelling and interacting with materials. That's not the reality of most working perfumers in the industry's day. They have to have a memory of all of these materials and know all of the interactions, because they have to pull a fragrance formula out of their head, without even smelling anything. They have to write up their formula on their software and send that down to the lab. That gets made up. Then they're tweaking it from a spreadsheet, from their software. And so, yes, you do have to have that level of training if you're going to be able to turn around, maybe 8 or 10 different projects you're juggling at a time. Some of them have got a few weeks turnaround time. That's a whole different thing, and that is not what I teach. And so the majority of people who come to me don't want to learn how to make a fragrance for a toilet cleaner. They want to learn how to make a beautiful fragrance either for themselves or to launch a product line, maybe a perfume oil, maybe I get a lot of hairdressers who are launching their own lines for hair care products, room fragrances, that kind of thing. The only thing I don't really delve into in depth is candle fragrances, because they are a whole beast. There's a lot of technical stuff that goes into creating candles. I'm not a candle maker myself, and then the other thing is cold process soap, where you've got a lot of chemicals interacting with the fragrance, and it can be quite tricky. Anything else is fair game, and I do believe that with the right training and with the dedication and practice, anybody can do this, but you do have to put the effort in. You have to get some training. You can be self-taught, absolutely. There's a lot of information out there online now. That's one of the reasons why I started my podcast, really, because I was getting a lot of people who said, I would love to learn more, but I can't afford to do lots of training. I can't come to the UK, can't come to classes. Is there anything else out there? And I wrote a book. 2013 now, my perfume book came out. And I just wanted to do something like a podcast where I could give tips and snippets for people who wanted to do it themselves.
It's an amazing sales tool as well, I imagine.
Yeah, I listened to podcasts for years. It means people can get to know me, and my ethos. There are so many different tools out there, so many different teachers now, and everybody's got a different way of doing things. And I just think that if you listen to somebody, like listen to some episodes of the podcast, you're going to know whether you're going to gel with my teaching or not. And so, yeah, it is a great sales tool. It's a great way for me to, promote my courses and classes as well. But also it's a great way for people to get some knowledge before they just jump in and invest a load of money, because it can be quite pricey buying materials. So listening to something like a podcast gives them that little toe in the water, if you like, and can test it out.
It does. And I would definitely direct people, especially to the very first and second episodes of your podcast. What I loved about them is that they really resonated with me in terms of how I teach people about wine, which is, bearing in mind this is such a huge, very sexy, but huge subject. Where do you start? And so I kind of developed my own way of teaching, where you're starting with the building blocks of wine, which is the grape varieties, which all have their own characteristics. And listening to you talk as well, that's where you start with your key oils, and then you build on from there. And I think what you lay out in those first couple of episodes really, really tells you a lot about what you need to know and what you need to have. So thinking about where you start when you want to learn about perfumery, are there like 3 or 4 steps to follow generally?
Yeah, definitely. I would say there are 3 things that you need to focus on when you're creating a fragrance. Obviously, you're going to need your materials. So the first thing is really get to know your fragrance materials. And I think the problem that I see people have is that it's very overwhelming. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different materials available, and people don't know where to start. So start learning your materials, but don't feel like you have to have memorized 200. You have to have invested in a whole kit or a perfumer's organ in order to start. Start small And I would say just pick a few materials from each of the fragrance categories. So you pick a few florals, some citruses, some woody notes, some spicy notes, some ambery vanilla-y notes, some green herbal notes. And I have this all laid out in a free starter guide that you can get from my website. And also, if you listen to the first couple of podcast episodes, I'll go through some of those as well. Just start small, but know the first thing is that unless you are familiar with your materials, you're really going to struggle to move forward. And when I say get familiar with your materials, it's also about be learning how to describe them as well. So it's all very well smelling something, but practice describing what it is you're smelling. And I'm sure this is exactly the same in wine. It's about the vocabulary and the communication is going to be the key make or break thing, because it's all very well saying, oh, well, I like this, I like that material. But if you don't know how to pull all of the details of that olfactory profile out of that one material, you're going to be going around in circles thinking, okay, well, I don't know what material to use, when actually it could have been right under your nose the whole time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is really when you start to go on to the next level, you start to blend. I think some people think, okay, I've got to learn all of the materials first, and I'm not, I can't blend them together because, something terrible will happen if I get it wrong. Don't be afraid of getting things wrong. So the second thing is do start to blend one or two things together, two or three things together in what we would call an accord. So, whenever I teach perfumery, I would never suggest anyone try to make a fragrance from scratch by taking like 10, 12 materials and piling them all in together. I see a lot of people doing that, and that's a big mistake. Chunk it down. Little building blocks. So start with creating a simple accord. And I always say to people, I would rather in a class that you create 10 accords of say 3 materials that work really nicely together than try and create a whole finished fragrance from scratch. Because once you have got used to smelling your materials and then blending them together, it will actually teach you more about the materials themselves, because you'll then learn how they interact. And then what you're going to have is this little library of building blocks that, even if it doesn't work the first time around when you mix them together, if they work on their own, the chances are they might work for another project. So that would be the second thing. Don't try and make a fragrance from scratch in one hit. Always chunk it down into little building blocks. And the third thing is really for when you're starting to create your first fragrances, make sure you've got a plan, a really clear story or a theme, or even if it's just an idea of what you want your fragrance to smell like. Because people just, they go for the materials and they say, okay, I love these 10 materials and I want to put them all into a perfume. And sometimes they just have no cohesiveness. They don't connect with each other. And if you've got, even if it's just a simple brief where you say, actually, I want to learn how to create a classic citrus cologne, for example, doesn't have to be a convoluted scent memory or story. When you're starting out, just learn how to make a citrus cologne, learn how to make a simple floral or an amber fragrance. Just keep it really, really basic, but always have that brief, always have that plan. And then if you're going to get a bit more ambitious, spend the time on creating the theme and the story before you do anything else, because that will help you select the materials that you're going to use in your fragrance, not the other way around. I don't know if it's the same in wine.
Well, what I have found, and I'm sure it's the same with perfumery, is like the more you increase your vocabulary, the more you get out of things that you smell and taste. Like I've been writing about wine for 20 years. And yet I was at an Asda press tasting a couple of weeks ago. There are over 100 wines. You've really got to be really hot on, what you're smelling, what you're getting. Perfumery has really helped me. It's increased my vocabulary massively just from doing that training. And I've always found that with wine, the more you look into it, the more you pay attention to it, the more you get out of it. It stops just tasting like wine. So yeah, perfumery, I imagine, is very similar like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, I mean, there is so much crossover. The whole thing about our sense of smell. and our sense of taste is obviously so interwoven. And we can only taste what is it, sweet, sour, bitter, salt, and umami, and everything else is aroma. So obviously a huge part of wine and picking out notes is aroma that you get from the back of your palate. And I haven't actually, it's one of those things that's on my list to like do some wine training. I've never done that before, but I did do a collaboration many years ago with a whiskey company to do a co-event and a pairing, and I was like, to be honest, I have no clue about whiskey, know nothing about it, feel a bit out of my depth. And they were like, oh, no, that's fine. What we would like you to do is come and talk to us about fragrance. And then we will do a training with you on whiskey tasting. And then before the event, and then we'll do the event. And so I learned how to taste whiskey, but it did increase my appreciation. And I'm not a whiskey drinker. Now, when I taste, if I taste different whiskies, I can pick out the Christmas cake notes or the orange notes or the peat notes, and they do taste very, very, very different. Actually, even if you're not interested in making perfume, it is really helpful to help you choose a fragrance as well.
Mm. And I think in terms of the similarities as well, what people who love perfume and people who love wine and work in wine tend to be very kind of creative sensory beings anyway. What I am really enjoying about perfumery is writing that brief. In fact, on my diploma, we're encouraged just to draw pictures, use colors, even if we don't
Yeah.
know what it is yet. And my place to start is, given what I do, is how do I sum up how I feel when I drink a Provençal rosé? And then you start thinking about the south of France and then the key notes of that. And you draw the pictures and you've written this beautiful story, which really appeals to me. And then you can try and create it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people work better with words and some people work better with imagery. So whether it's, I love mind maps. So I've got a whole course that I give to my mastermind students on scent design, which actually essentially is creating a mind map for your fragrance. And I love words. So I do a mind map with words. But a lot of people do a mood board, Canva, Pinterest. They're all really great tools for doing that. If you can't draw, I mean, we used to like tear pictures out of magazines back in the day, but have a look on Pinterest, have a look on Canva, and create a mood board. And that is really going to help you dive into the feeling. And that's one of the other things that's really important to touch on, is that fragrance is a very huge contributor to mood, sense of well-being. And the way our sense of smell works, it ties in with our memories. And we are very visual as human beings. We're very visual. So we will always have pictures in our brain, and we will link those to emotions as well. Certain colors and certain sounds, and certain smells will always make us feel a certain way. And so when you are looking at creating a fragrance, always think about, if you're creating it for yourself or you're creating it for someone else, think about how you want that other person to feel when they're smelling or using that fragrance, because that is why people buy perfume at the end of the day, because it makes them feel good. And there's loads of neuroscience studies now proving that different fragrances and different notes and different scents can make us feel different things. So yeah, the science is sort of catching up with what we as human beings have known for millennia, probably.
Do you think that's why niche perfumery or independent perfumery has exploded recently? A, because people can have a little bit more impetus into what they want it for, and it's not just a nice smell. They don't just want to smell like everyone else, but actually they do want to feel differently. In episode 1 of this podcast, we spoke to Professor Barry Smith. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's a doctor of philosophy, but he's all about sensory crossover, synesthesia, and cross-modalism.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about the impact of smell on our psyche, but also how smell practice can stave off dementia. So having some agency over what you want to smell like and creating that yourself is obviously one of the reasons why making your own perfume has gone nuts. I mean, what else do you think it is? And is it since COVID?
Yeah. I mean, I noticed, I sort of stepped out of the industry for years, and I stepped back into the industry in the way of teaching like independently. Was it back in 2010, 2011? And that, I think, was when I really noticed the rise of what we would call niche perfumery. The way I teach artisan perfumery, which again is a slightly different strand to niche, I believe. Niche perfumery came about really because people wanted to smell different. They didn't want to smell, like the mainstream big brands. And so these little niche brands started popping up. But then what happened is that the big brands saw that the niche was sort of taking a big chunk of the pie. And so they started to invest in niche, in that they would either buy up some of the niche brands, or they actually started their own niche sidelines. And I think that the issue with the terminology niche is a lot of the fragrances that are considered niche are still made by the big houses. And so even though they are more expensive, they're made in smaller quantities and maybe more kind of what we would call niche concepts behind them. Now they seem quite almost have gone into the mainstream. And so then what we're seeing underlying that is the rise of the indie and artisan brands who are literally doing everything themselves. So they are sourcing their own materials. Often self-taught. Yes, there are quite a few indie perfumers now who are industry trained, who have stepped out of the industry and who are doing their own thing. So they still have their contacts in the industry, but they are able to be more creative. So there's that group of people as well. But what I see a lot of, and the people that I teach and I have in sort of my world, are really the kind of true indie from the ground up, self-taught, or done my program or done programs or diplomas with some of the other independent teaching organizations that are out there, who are literally coming up with the brief. They're their own creative director. They're sourcing their own materials. They're setting up their own little perfume labs, starting out at home and then maybe moving into a unit as they get bigger. They are doing all their own social media marketing on TikTok, and TikTok has been great for some of the indie and artisan brands, because it means that you don't have the economies of scale in terms of materials costs of the big brands. We might be paying probably 10 or 20 times more per kilo or gram for a material than some of the big companies, because they're buying by the ton. So it's going to be a lot more expensive for the indie and the artisan brands to get started. But actually, now we've got social media, especially with TikTok, with Instagram. You can reach the customer directly, and you don't have to be pitching to Harrods or Harvey Nichols to get on the shelf there. You can literally sell to customers directly on something like TikTok shop or a Facebook shop or an Instagram shop, or even your own kind of Shopify store. So yeah, I think there's a lot more creativity. They're able to do bespoke, one-off fragrances for people. And I would say to anyone doing that, be really, really wary of hopping onto a trend, because that will just, if that trend goes, your business will die a death. So I would always come up with your own really strong USP, your strong brand story. You don't have to launch a huge fragrance line. You can start with one fragrance. There are lots of people out there who have created this one amazing scent that they love. And the key is to be very, very proud of what you have created. There are always going to be critics. Not everybody is going to like what you do. But as long as you love it and you've got customers paying you for it, you've got a business, you've got a brand, you are a perfumer. And whilst the industry might not recognize you as a perfumer or a nose, if you are creating beautiful scents and you are selling them and people are loving them and giving you money for them, you have every right to call yourself a perfumer.
That is such a good point. I've seen very similar things in wine communication, actually. In fact, for years, I didn't have the confidence to put myself out there, because I thought, oh, I need to have done this qualification. I need to have written for this magazine, done this, this, and this. And actually, I've seen amazing women just come into industry who are just passionate about it. And even though they might not have all the knowledge and all the tools and all the exams and all the qualifications, but what they're doing really well is translating that passion into people buying more wine, and they're working with brands, and it's working because they're unafraid of what the old guard might say, because what they are doing is working.
I think that's really interesting, actually, on that point. And this is what I've seen with complete newbies who have no clue how the industry works. And they're almost coming in with this kind of like naive passion and really going for it and launching something and putting it out there, and people are loving it. It works. And the ones that have been in the industry and they've had the kind of, what would you call it? The dogma of being told, oh no, this is not how it works here. You
Yeah.
can't do this. Actually, they're the ones who get massive imposter syndrome. They procrastinate. They're scared to put themselves out there because they know that they're all out of their lane, or they're not staying in the lane that they're supposed to be in. And actually, they've got way more experience and knowledge, but they're not doing it. And then the newbies come along and just go, yeah, well, why couldn't I do this?
It's
Yes.
equally annoying and impressive, isn't it? Being someone who's done all the training and finally got to a place where I could do it because I've got the information now. I'm a valid person, and these people swan in. I honestly, it's 50-50 really annoying, 50-50 really impressive.
I know, it always blows me away each time I see someone do that, and it's, I just do think that sometimes we have to, get out of our own heads and our own ways and just harness some of that beginner's curiosity and that beginner's passion, and just going for it and just
It keeps you on your toes as well. I've learned a lot from like the younger
yeah.
generation coming up who are just straight away out there. They've done one masterclass and now they're taking the class. Yeah, I've learned a lot from that, and I'm grateful for it, I must say. So, can you tell people where to find you, your workshops and your
Yes.
podcast, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. So I am based in the UK, so in the New Forest, and I have a studio in the New Forest where I do in-person classes. I don't do very many. I do a few a year, just because I have majority of my audience seem to be overseas, and so the majority of my classes I teach online. So I've got a year-long artisan perfumery mastermind program. So if that's for people who are really serious about it, they can come and join that, and it's a whole year long program. I have lots of little short masterclasses for people who want to dip their toe in the water as well. And the main thing I would say to anyone who wants to get to know a bit more about perfumery, get to know my teaching style, just listen to the podcast first. It's the Perfume Making Podcast. So you can find that on Spotify or Apple or any of the podcast apps, or even on my website, which is just karengilbert.co.uk. I'm fairly easy to find on social media. I'm very, very passionate about helping complete beginners and newbies. I've had people from the industry come to my classes. I've had people who just have come for a nice day out, who've no interest in starting a brand, and everything in between.
Karen Gilbert, thank you very much.
So, once again, things I just would never have even considered, I've learnt about here. Dealing with perfumery and the scented things that hadn't even crossed my mind that applies to detergents and more functional things like she discusses, and how that would need a certain different approach, different qualifications for different reasons to the beauty industry, or if you want to do it for yourself. And I love how knowledgeable she is about it and really passionate about the artisan side, having had her experience, working for big perfume, like she said, but as well as the more niche stuff too. And I bet her
Mm,
studio smells lush.
I bet it does. One thing that I've really noticed from doing this perfumery course, like, and it goes so beautifully hand in hand with wine, is that it gives you sort of so many benefits, so many other things. It enhances different parts of your life. It really feels like a type of acceptable playing to me, and she said as much herself. And I think it really is that, and that's so important for us as humans, but especially as adults, as we've forgotten to, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, after a certain age, you're encouraged almost not to play anymore, and everything gets really serious. Whereas that must cut out the joy of life by about 50%. So yeah, I totally agree. But I see it, it's hand in hand with doing anything creative as well. Like anything creative is a type of play, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you can see why actually people try to get their companies to do away days or have a little session doing something like this or something creative as a team, because after working on something like trying to build your own perfume or drawing a mind map, you're in that creative headspace. And so you can go and solve problems in a completely unrelated area because you can think more creatively. I mean, that's something I hadn't quite considered, but it's really important.
One thing I really liked, which I took from this, which I think you can actually apply to anything in life, was that building block approach, where she was talking about the accords, where she mixes a couple of smells together to create the building blocks for the whole fragrance, and encouraging people to not try and get the end result immediately, and just have these little pieces you can take in and out, but they exist in and of themselves. I think anything, especially what I do, I'm a sculptor at heart, but I flirt with a bit of abstract painting. And I have such a problem where I try and see the painting as a whole before I've even put paintbrush to canvas. But I know what you should really do is have pages and pages of sketchbooks with little microcosms and experiments that you can build up and put them on the canvas, but then you can take them away, but they still exist on their own. So you haven't wasted that energy on that one little pocket of creativity. So I really loved that approach to it, because it's just the antithesis of overwhelm, isn't it? Because when you just try and get something done immediately, you need that creative process. You need those little blocks.
I 100% love that, because, and the reason I really enjoyed Karen's podcast is because that's exactly how I teach wine. Because, like Perfumery, wine is a huge subject. And for years and years, listening to people, I just didn't agree with where they started with when they tried to teach it, because it didn't make any sense. I mean, it's all like most people when they're teaching wine, it's about this is how a wine is made, malolactic fermentation and oak barrels. And it's just like there's no frame of reference whatsoever. What I'd say in my classes is like, to me, that's always been like opening a novel at chapter 10 and trying to work out what the hell's going on. There's no frame of reference. It's not the right way around. I do building blocks too. And like Karen describes each like oil, each aroma to be a building block, and then you put them together like accords. To me, those are the grape varieties. You get to know the characteristics of the world's most famous grapes, and then you can understand what they're like blended together, etc. So I love her approach, and it's very, very similar to what I do. So I guess I would.
I mean, I've learnt what I know about wine, which still is very little, from that exact approach, just hanging out with you. Because it's always been something I've felt quite impenetrable, and it's very serious. I'm not at that level of interest where I feel, God, do I need to learn that just to understand how to drink a bottle? Whereas what you have really helped me with is just like the basics of understanding the grape. And I like a Chardonnay, absolutely detest a Pinot Grigio. And it starts from no understanding the grape varieties, and then where I can go from there. And so, whereas I'm not a wino, well, actually I am a wino, but whereas I'm not a wine expert, it has helped just make a few more informed choices.
Yeah, and that's the idea. And I think importantly, it gives people a place to start on quite what could be a big convoluted journey. You start with the building blocks and then expand out.
Yeah.
But when we're thinking about what else getting to know something like perfume or wine actually can give you, it's so much more than just that one thing. It seems like, for me, studying my oils and getting to know my oils, it's so mindful. It really takes me out of my head. That and massively expanded vocabulary. I mean, I've been in wine for 24 years. I'd like to think I can write a tasting note, even when I'm in a room full of wines and have to write something about all of them, and they're all kind of technically the same. My vocabulary's massively increased. A wine number 74 at an As a Press tasting recently, I was finding ylang ylang and orange blossom, and like, oh, wow, okay. So it's not just kind of orangey.
But I get that with other things too. Like when I go in to get my hair bleached and I have to describe what kind of colour I want, I need the vocab for that. Do you want it ashy? Do you want it cool? Do you want it icy? And I'm like, I just want it to look like Courtney Love circa 1995, please. But, and that's just colours. When I've shopped for perfume as well, for someone else particularly, and they're like, what kind of thing are you looking for? And they're like, just want it to smell nice. You realise the importance.
You might have a scent, a signature scent, say, or something that you just love wearing forever, and they discontinue it. If you don't know what's in that at all, it's really, really sad, actually. But if you know that, actually it's amber dominant and it's got a bit of this in it, it's got a bit of this in it, then you know how to find another one, because you have that vocabulary as well.
And some perfumes are quite explicit, aren't they? Jo Malone was generally like, it does what it says on the tin, like lime, basil, and mandarin. But that has, I think, led the way for so many knockoffs, hasn't it? Yeah, like Aldi Lidl, the White Company, they all have diffusers, and it's kind of copied. The branding looks exactly the same even, and they've just got the same words. And I see lime, I see fig, and I'm like, oh, I know what they're going to smell like. They're going to smell like that Joe Malone vibe. But the perfume makers are potentially opening themselves up to get people who make knockoffs ripping them off.
Yeah, that's a whole issue in the industry, and how you IP your perfume.
Yeah, because I guess the ingredients, they're not patented, aren't they? Like orange blossom, you can't own that, can you? It's a bit like when we were talking to Alex, our mushroom farmer, about his mushroom tinctures and mushrooms as medicine. It's like it's impossible to patent and own like a particular mushroom because it is something that exists and that grows. So as soon as a company that can make a knockoff perfume gets wind of what's in a Joe Malone or a Diptyque or a Le Labo, then they're creating a real smell alike. And I know people who buy smell alikes, and a lot of them smell alike.
They do. Do you know? I heard Karen talking about this in a podcast, on one of hers recently, actually, and just the bit I remember is that actually, if you get to a stage where people are knocking off your perfume, you're already onto the next thing. You've already created another 5 or 10 scents, and yours will always be the original. So you're obviously doing something right, which is interesting. But again, I don't know enough about that to really comment.
What also is a really big conversation for anyone wanting to start from scratch, anything creative, which requires some knowledge or training, is the general feeling that all you need nowadays is a YouTube tutorial and some gumption, and you're up and away. I mean, where are these courses that are thousands of pounds? I just don't need them. Like I'd even argue, if my kids want to do something creative, I'd be like, I don't think you don't need to go to university. It's a waste of time and money. I am classically a hands-in clay sculptor, but I'd really like to learn how to do 3D sculpting, which is basically the 3D equivalent of Photoshop for special effects in films and animation and stuff. And I contacted this guy I follow who was really, really kind. And he works at a really prolific Soho studio doing all those like After Effects and special effects. And I just said, could you advise of some kind of course I could do? And he's like, well, there are courses you could do, but they're thousands and thousands of pounds. But just watch this guy on YouTube, and that's all you need. If you've got a stylus and a Mac, that is all you need. And I feel like there's something quite similar here. And like you're talking about like that, she talks about the newbies, and it must be really frustrating for people who have done the studying. Like your very classical schooling and what you studied at uni have definitely contributed to where you've got to with wine, with your languages and everything. But could you have bypassed all of that? Like if you were to start now, would you personally genuinely think you would need all those years of studying, or could you have just watched a YouTube tutorial and taken it from there?
Well, I mean, don't even. I mean, you'll hear me say in that it's equally, 50% annoying, 50% impressive. And it honestly is, it is that. I am impressed. In my line of work, in the communication side, which is what I always wanted to do, there was no one doing it 24 years ago, which is why I set up my YouTube channel with my dog. I was so kind of shy about it. I didn't put myself out there enough because no one else was doing it and no one was supporting. Now, since Instagram, it's like anyone with a passion can just build an audience, and they can share that passion, and they're bloody successful at it. And it's really good. And it's really annoying because I feel like I'm 20 years behind where I should be.
But that's the thing, it's the standard now. But if anything, you could say that you actually were one of the pioneers. You were a content creator before content creators were even a thing.
Yeah, my YouTube channel was essentially what TikTok is for now.
So, as much as this is about perfumery, what is also evident in this conversation is that snobbery is still alive and kicking in every fucking industry, every corner you turn. But now we're allowed to go and just find the alternative route to, make a shortcut, to not spend years having to feel you need to get a degree, but also that doing so isn't any less legitimate. And another lovely thing that she cements as well is that you can't please everyone. And if you're selling something, you're a success.
Also, there might be something that you feel like you really would quite like to do as a hobby, but it feels completely inaccessible to you. Whereas something like this actually can be accessible. You don't need to have a chemistry degree to go and have a play. And that may turn into a building a brand, or it may just be something you love doing.
Well, on that note, I think that's a good time to wrap up. Thank you, Karen. I love that. And I feel like you've allowed me to go and create in a different way in all these millions of different things I want to do, which is okay. Next week, we'll be talking to James Whelan about the life of bees.
Yeah, and how important they are and things that you never knew about them. In the meantime, don't forget that there are lots of different new articles out on flockandhive.com. We do have our newsletter going live now every 2 weeks, so please sign up for that, because there'll be little extras in that you don't see on the website and you don't hear on the podcast. And follow us on social media at Flock and Hive.
And remember, if you have anything you feel you'd like us to talk about, or if you're an expert in something yourself, get in touch, because we would love to talk to you.
But in the meantime, we'll see you next week. Ta-ta!
Bye!